Hi, everyone. I tend to be somebody who cares a lot about terminology, not for the sake of showing off or just trying to sound smart or be overly technical, but rather because if we are very clear on what we mean by certain things, and if we can identify when somebody uses a word in a different way from how we're using it, we can avoid confusion. That's particularly important with things like exercise science, where people talk about, or they toss around sometimes these technical terms that used to have a very specific definition or were created for a specific reason, and then we start to kind of move them into a different area they weren't intended for. So I want to talk about that. Specifically, I want to talk about these terms for muscle contraction and how they might be confusing or get us in a little bit of trouble. Okay? So it's widely accepted. There are issues with these terms, but it is widely accepted that there are pretty clear definitions, at least in general, for concentric, isometric, and eccentric. These are terms that are used commonly in the exercise science world. Now, concentric and eccentric originally came from a different sort of context where they meant something a little different, but they've been used for so long in biomechanics textbooks, exercise science textbooks, physiology books, that the community has kind of just accepted them as meaning certain things. So if you look at my arm, the elbow flexors, if they try to generate tension and they successfully flex the elbow, that means they are working concentrically. If they are generating tension in the direction of elbow flexion, but elbow extension is occurring instead, then those muscles are working eccentrically. And I'm trying to use these terms very carefully to describe what's happening from the perspective of a given muscle. Because when you talk about all of the muscles, it might be a little different. You may have a muscle, one muscle that's only crossing this joint, like my brachialis only crosses the elbow. But the biceps brachii actually cross at the shoulder, and they're also manipulating stuff at the radioulnar joint. So they're doing a lot more stuff. So if my arm's moving through space, or if maybe I'm flexing here, but I'm also pronating here. And I'm also extending here at the shoulder. Well, if I'm doing all of those things at the same time, is it an eccentric or is it a concentric? That's something we need to think about. And I'm going to give it to you in the context of an exercise everybody always wants to talk about, a squat. A general kind of squat-like motion anyway, okay? People talk about these things and they use terms for muscle contractions to describe phases of a lift, phases or portions of an exercise. Basically, they're using these muscle physiology or muscle mechanics terms to describe choreography. And sometimes that can get us in trouble. Again, if we lock everything else down and we're only moving at the elbow, then yeah, you could say these muscles are working concentrically when I do this. They're working eccentrically if they're pulling, but I'm doing this. And then they're working isometrically, or they're acting isometrically, if the muscle length isn't changing and the joint angle ends up not changing. There are ways you can play with these definitions if you define it in terms of the joint angle instead of in terms of the muscle length. I'm not worried about that right now. But let's look at the squat and look at something that might break down, okay? This will be a little cumbersome because I don't have an assistant, so I apologize, and I don't have a model where everything is attached, so I'm just kind of doing this in space. But if we look at the hip extensors, so we have the glute max, we have 3 of the 4 hamstring muscles. We have the biceps femoris long head, the semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, right? Well, all of those muscles are attaching back here somewhere. You have, let's see if I can switch my hands here. I don't know if I can, right? So you have the glute max, which is covering a whole lot of this area, plus maybe over towards the sacrum, okay? So you have a bunch of real estate back here with that muscle, that big old muscles covering. And of course, we know this, right? People are obsessed with glutes. They want to make their butts look good in their pants or whatever. And so they're trying to do these hip extension-y exercises, including the squat, perhaps, or including hip thrusts or glute bridges or other things, so they can build that muscle. Well, that muscle, as well as 3 of the 4 hamstrings, cross back here. So when they work concentrically, if nothing else is involved, we're not paying attention to anything else, they will create hip extension. They will bring the femur back in this direction towards the pelvis, or they will bring the pelvis back this way towards the femur, whichever way you want to think about it. So as we go down into a squat, this should not be very controversial, right? You can think of this as the upper attachment maybe of the glute max if you want to be up here, or let's look at the hamstrings. because the hamstrings are really what I want to talk about more here anyway. They all attach somewhere around this gluteal, this ischial tuberosity. Gluteal tuberosity is here on the femur, right? But this ischial tuberosity, butt bone, if you will, okay? So you got this attachment here, and you got the hamstrings coming down somewhere. Those three actually end up all attaching somewhere on the tibia. So we come down, and as we go deeper into a squat, what's going to happen? Well, we're actually stretching or lengthening this even more. That shouldn't be too hard to see. If you demonstrate this, if you get like some tubing or a balloon or whatever like I'm using, you can feel it, you can see it, and if you know where muscles attach, this shouldn't be controversial. So as I go deeper into that squat, this is what's happening. Cool beans, no problem. Just like the glute max, those muscles would work eccentrically if they were allowing hip flexion to occur with gravity like this. No problem. The confusion comes up when you start looking at the knee end of things. So people call that lowering portion of the squat an eccentric because we've learned historically that, oh yeah, when the weight goes up, that's the concentric. When the weight goes down, that's the eccentric. And that is because in many cases, the muscle is working concentrically as we lift the weight against gravity or as we pull against a machine or something. And then as we lower that weight or let it out, that is the eccentric, or that corresponds to an eccentric muscle action. So since we see that trend in the gym, we've often fallen into this trap of kind of taking a shortcut and starting to say, oh, this is the concentric phase of the lift. This is the eccentric phase of the lift. And when people talk about a squat, as you go down into a squat, people say, oh yeah, well, the weight's going down. We're assuming a bunch of stuff is lengthening. And so we're going to call that the eccentric. But is it really the eccentric? Well, some of you, if you know your anatomy decently, you already know where I'm going with this. If we look at femur on tibia, this knee joint thing, right? Well, we've got muscles, these hamstring muscles, all four of them. So including the short head of the biceps femoris, or femoris, tomato, tomato. I was trying to hold this up, I apologize, it's kind of awkward. And they're all back here somewhere, and they're attaching somewhere on the tibia to the back of that, say, the tibial plateau up there, or they're attaching kind of in front. They're wrapping around to the pes anserine, where you have the semitendinosus, the gracilis, and the sartorius. But at any rate, you have all of that stuff relative to the knee. Let's ignore what's happening up at the hip, getting shortened. Because if those muscles were to shorten on their own, they were to work concentrically, they would flex the knee. Right? They would do a hamstring curl, or they would, if you're standing, they would pull the femur down towards the tibia, pull the back of the femur like this, right? You would increase the amount of flexion, or someone would say actually decrease the angle in the back. You can define it a bunch of different ways. So you have this situation happening. We're going down into a squat, and relative to the knee, or at the knee end, from that perspective, those muscles are being shortened. But we just said that at the hip, they're being lengthened. So what's really happening here? Well, they're both happening. You have lengthening occurring up here as we go into the squat. So if we're just looking at that, we could indeed say that, oh yeah, the hamstrings are eccentrically doing stuff. But there's shortening. There's an increase in slack here at the knee end. So those muscles might be getting longer over here, but they're getting shorter over here. So is it really an eccentric? I don't know. What I would say is that it depends on the anatomy of the individual. So depending on how long these bones are, these levers, depending on where exactly these muscles attach, maybe they attach a little farther at this joint, or they attach a little closer to the joint. The shapes of the joints themselves, so all this anatomical stuff, your bony structure and where stuff's attaching, will determine whether, for example, maybe you have a situation like this, where a whole lot of lengthening is happening right here, because just the shape of this hip joint and all the anatomy up here determines that, or dictates that there's going to be a lot of stretching or lengthening of those muscles. And there might be relatively little shortening here at the knee. So in that case, maybe you could call it an eccentric phase for those muscles. Maybe. You'd have to know how much length change happens up here and down here. Maybe you have the opposite. Maybe somebody has a whole lot of shortening that occurs here at the knee, and not a whole lot of lengthening up here. So actually, when they get into the bottom of their squat, I can use this here. Let's attach the whole thing, right? So we got the whole leg here. As they get into the bottom of their squat, maybe their muscles are actually shorter here than when they're up here at the top. Well, I just hyperextended the knee there, right? So for them, this would be a relatively shortened position. So you could almost call this phase the concentric for them in a way, depending on how you want to define it based on the amount of tension being generated by the hamstrings. So it gets a little tricky, right? You have to pay attention to that. Now, why am I bringing this up? Often, as I said earlier, people will define a phase of an exercise in terms of muscle actions. They will try to pair them, but they're not one-to-one, particularly when you're looking at these mechanical actions, these whole body movements that involve a lot of different muscles, some of which cross multiple joints. And their actions at multiple joints are kind of are inverse from each other, or that is, a muscle during that particular movement, that muscle might be shortened at one joint but then lengthened at the next joint, or vice versa. We see this a lot. I was just talking about it with the biceps brachii, right? Because those muscles, both the long and short head, will cross at the shoulder, they will cross at the elbow, and they also control, you can say cross at the radial-ulnar joint. So we have to pay attention to that. Let's give you a practical thing just to think about. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole too far with this, but consider this. People will talk about like the stretch shortening cycle. They will say that maybe you bounce out of the hole if you're trying to stimulate that stretch shortening cycle because you're getting a rapid eccentric lengthening of a muscle. If you're not familiar with the stretch shortening cycle, the basic premise, as far as we are concerned right now, just holds that if you rapidly lengthen a muscle that you're trying to use, you can stimulate the muscle spindles to react by telling that muscle to contract out of that stretch. And so you might get a more intense contraction, a stronger contraction than you otherwise would. It's why that's part of the reason anyway, why we do a counter movement where we squat down before we jump up. That's part of why we wind up before we throw something. And indeed, some tissues are certainly being lengthened when we do that. But are all of the tissues being lengthened? I would argue not all the time. And how much lengthening, again, will depend on the anatomy. It will depend on that individual person, where their muscles are attaching, the lengths of their levers, the shapes of their joints. Okay? So if a person is saying that we're going to do this specifically to use the stretch shortening cycle in the hamstrings, well, examine that closely. And maybe there is some of that happening, but not as much as they say, because you are getting lengthening at that hip end. So maybe you can get some of that going. But at the knee end, maybe not so much, right? Because its action there, when it tries to shorten, is actually to flex the knee, which would pull you down. And then, everything I just said, if you apply it to the quads, you have the opposite situation happening. Where, if you look at this, right, as we are going down deeper and deeper into the squat, well, the quad muscles at the knee are all lengthening. And indeed, 3 of those muscles only cross the knee. The vasti muscles only cross the knee. So this is the only one we need to look at. So if we're talking about the lowering portion of a squat being an eccentric, I would say it's more accurate to say that that's the case when we talk about the quads than it is when we talk about the hamstrings. So pay attention. When people say this is the concentric or this is the eccentric, you should ask yourself, for what muscles? That matters. It may be the case that you have certain muscles that are mostly or entirely being eccentrically lengthened as we drop into that squat, and other muscles or divisions of muscles, portions of muscle groups or what have you, that maybe you're kind of roughly staying the same length overall. And that might have some implications for when we talk about whether we're rapidly getting a muscle spindle response out of them, when people are talking about starting to train things a certain way and they're saying that this is lengthening and this is shortening. So if you have a good grasp of that, and you can look at the anatomy, you can look at where those muscles are and where those bones are and where those attachments should be, and you can understand what should be lengthening or shortening as something is moving, you might not be fooled, or you might not be misled. I'm not trying to say that people who talk about this kind of training are trying to fool you. Most of them are not, but they could inadvertently be leading to misconceptions. So that's what I wanted to talk about there. again, try to visualize that. Try to visualize what's happening with the hamstrings at the hip versus the knee. Try to look at what's happening to the quadriceps at the hip and at the knee. So, and there's a flip because, or there's an inversion, if you will, because an opposite scenario, that's a better way to put it. Because at the hip, you have 3 of the 4 hamstrings that cross both joints, the hip and the knee. Only one crosses one joint, the short head biceps fem. But the opposite is the case with the quads. 3 of the 4 quads only cross the knee, and only the rectus femoris crosses the knee as well as the hip. So that's why I said, actually, for the quads, it's probably more generally, it's a safer bet to call the lowering portion an eccentric when you're talking about the quads than when you're talking about the hamstrings. So this could go on forever. I could talk for hours and hours about different joints in the body. I encourage you, look at other joints where you have multi-articular muscles and see if you can come up with scenarios where you go, oh wait, that's not really an eccentric, or that's not really a concentric, or it's not just cleanly one or the other, or it is for certain muscles but not for others. If you understand your anatomy well, for example, you should be able to come up very easily with an exercise that works, that is challenging, say, your biceps and your triceps at the same time and not isometrically, or that is doing so where there is a lot of motion, at least at the joints. What's going on there? You should be able to think of at least one, perhaps several. So that's my challenge to you. Look at those joints, look at those multi-articular muscles, and see if you can come up with other scenarios. See if you can see what I was talking about. Visualize what's happening to those muscles as those joints are moving. Hopefully that helps to inoculate you a little bit against some of the misconceptions that are out there. And with that, I think I'm going to let you all go. I might do some more of these videos in the future. I'm also going to continue with the martial arts videos. I'm going to continue with some other isolated kind of exercise videos where I'm demonstrating stuff. I'm going to try to give an assortment of things. So if you like this, give it a thumbs up. If you want to hear or see more of this, please subscribe. That would really help me out. Leave suggestions in the comments about additional stuff that I can talk about. If you want me to bust out the whiteboard, I can do that. I got markers and a whiteboard right over here. And yeah, just let me know. Ask questions, or at least try to let this cause some thoughts to percolate in your mind. And I hope it was interesting, helpful, thought-provoking, something like that. And with that, I will let you all go, so I'll catch you all next time. Stay safe, keep thinking, stay smart, all that jazz. Take care.